podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm Helen O'Grady, a master executive coach and coach supervisor, and your host for this in-depth series on coaching supervision. Each episode delves into a distinctive aspect of supervision with leading practitioners and thought leaders in the field, uncovering the nuanced ways supervision enhances coaching practice, supports well-being and drives professional growth. Whether you're a seasoned supervisor, a coach curious about supervision, or simply interested in the dynamics of reflective practice, this series offers illuminating conversations that will transform how you think about coaching excellence. So welcome. I'm delighted to have Anna Springett here today as my guest. She's a chartered coaching psychologist, an occupational psychologist, an accredited coaching supervisor, a coach, director of Oki Retreats, and she'll talk about them for coaches, which I've been on, and Springett Consulting. So it's lovely to have you, Anna. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely lovely to be here, especially with somebody that I've met and have great respect for. So thank you, Helen, for having me.
Pleasure. You are here to talk about something that I think is really crucial for coaching supervision and very fundamental, but also quite complex. It's probably easier if you explain it in your language and then I'll chip in.
Sure, thank you. So the topic for our conversation is around contracting in as supervisors. And I think you reached out to me, Helen, because of some conversations we've had before about the book I'm currently researching and writing, which is due to be published in 2026. And I think we've talked about it a number of different occasions. I came to the topic as a supervisor. I just noticed in my practice that very, very often, whatever the topic, whatever the case study that people were bringing to the supervision, there was an element of going back to what was in the contract, or how did you contract, or how did you set things up from the beginning, how things might need to change. And I started to realize that actually it seems so utterly foundational to our work, whatever our work, whether we're consultants, coaches, or supervisors. And became incredibly interested in that. And as a psychologist, particularly around how do we create the psychological conditions in our work to contain our work, and where does the contracting come into that? So that's my really quick overview introduction to how I arrived at writing a book on the subject.
Oh, that's great. And I think it's easy for us to assume that we all are talking from the same hymn sheet when we talk about contracting.
Yes.
But actually, it's a word that's used in so many different contexts.
Yes.
I'm married to a lawyer, so his definition of a contract is very different from maybe what we think.
Yeah.
How would you define it in a coaching and coach supervision context?
Yes, so 100% agree that there are lots of different definitions. And so through my work, I have come to a definition that I'm actually using throughout the book. And it seems to me to capture the various different angles of what we mean by contracting in our work as coaches and supervisors and team coaches, which is that a contract defines and contains the relationships and the work. So a contract defines and contains the relationships and the work. And so when you start to break that down, there's the defining of what are the relationships, what are the roles, what are the boundaries. So there's lots within that. There's defining also the work. What are these two people or this group of people getting together to do? So in their particular roles, and what is it that we're actually working on? So there's some clarification and boundaries around the relationships and also around the work. And then the containing part of it has a lot of different angles to it. Again, the word containment is used in lots of different ways. Officially, shall we say, or if you were to look it up in the psychological literature, there's something called emotional containment, which is very much linked to attachment theory. And there's a few key theorists in this space, Bion, B-I-O-N, for those listening, and also Winnicott's concept of the holding space. So those are some of the psychological theories that underpin containment. But often supervisors and coaches as well, we use the term container, creating a container. And the way we use it is in various different ways. But essentially what I think people are talking about when they use that term is how is the contract or the relational agreement that we are creating between us going to hold the work that needs to happen in our relationship. And that includes things like psychological safety and boundaries, whatever emotions I might bring. I need to know that I can bring. So the idea of emotional containment comes from child development, human development, that if I bring this emotion into this space, can it be contained? As a young child developing, the mother was actually seen as the container. And in counselling, psychology, the counsellor is the container. And so if I bring this aspect of me, can you hold it? So this idea of containment and holding are very closely linked. Can you hold what I'm bringing for me for a while so that I can do the work that is needed, and then I'll take it back into myself. So that's the kind of psychological underpinnings. Whereas within supervision and coaching, we don't necessarily mean it in exactly that way. Probably we're talking about the relational container or the contracting container. Can it contain whatever needs to happen within our relationship and through our work? So the two things are definitely linked, but I think we use the terminology slightly differently as coaches and supervisors.
As you were explaining there, the word that was coming up was responsibility. Like, as a mother and a counsellor, maybe we have more responsibility, whereas coaches and coach supervisors, we may not take it off somebody, but we might try and create a space where they feel able to put it out there and, as you say, do the work.
Yes, and there's some work been done. There's some research available on, particularly in the space of team coaching, so the team coach as the container. So the idea of whether it's the contractor or the coach, mother, counsellor, therapist, let's say the people practitioner. So there's an aspect of, am I the container or is the contract the container? And in some ways it's semantics, but the human dynamic that happens is that, can it be contained? So where it's contained in some ways is semantics, and actually it's just theoretical anyway. But the idea or the concept of containment is it safe for me to bring this here? So if we think about specifically supervision, which is why we're talking about it, can I bring my deepest fears as a coach to this supervision relationship? What are the things I'm not talking about in supervision? And therefore, as a supervisor, how can we create the conditions so that our supervisees know that what they bring can be contained? So I can bring it, so therefore I can do the work that's needed. Because if I don't feel that it's psychologically safe for me to bring these vulnerabilities or these fears here, then I won't ever be doing the work on that.
So what are the conditions, or how do supervisors create?
Yeah, really good question. Can you answer that one for me, Helen?
It's making me reflect on, and I put it on LinkedIn yesterday, when it didn't work last week, I stuffed up and I didn't get the containment right. And that doesn't happen very often. And I was working with a senior person who was able to say, kind of what's going on here, basically. Yes. And so that we were able to bring it back. So I think contracting, I didn't do enough explicit contracting. Assumptions, checking our assumptions of what somebody's needing, maybe about how vulnerable they're feeling. Again, I'd misunderstood how vulnerable this person was feeling when they showed up. And then I think there's something about authenticity. And that's a fine line, I think, isn't it, both as a coach and a coach supervisor, of how much of ourselves we put out there. And that varies. Some clients need to see quite a bit of us before they can do the work, and others don't need to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question. I think particularly when you look at any of the coaching professional bodies, or indeed any of the books that have been written about coaching, about supervision, about team coaching, contracting is listed as an essential skill. It's listed in every, ethical framework, in every professional standard, a set of professional standards. And yet when it comes to how do we do that well, I would hazard a guess that there aren't many coaches or supervisors who can say, I absolutely know exactly what I need to do to create the conditions for containment. So I think it's a really important question. And of course, something I'm passionate about, and what's led to me, doing lots of desk research and conversations to really explore what is included in that. I think if we consider what's different to supervision and coaching, the process is often the same in terms of what we need to consider. So being clear about what the purpose of the relationship is, understanding the context and the background and what's led to us being in this relationship. So that's similar. Having a systemic awareness around what is the orienting ourselves within our client system is important. I think probably more so for supervisors particularly, and I would say for team coaches as well. There's a real importance in terms of being systemically aware. What are the organizations, the other people Who do we need to consider? Who are the other voices in the room? And those things are really important to have that clear understanding so that we don't make any assumptions about the context, about the purpose, about the relationships. And there are a number of particular nuances that we need to consider if we're doing group supervision, such as clarifying the relationships in the room already. And I would include relationships with the supervisor. Something I like to do in group supervision at the very beginning is have everyone understand how people all ended up in this space together. So, for example, if we were working together like we are here, we'd maybe share how we've met before. We've met in this context, or we've come across each other in these spaces. We've maybe had this client in common, or we've been in supervision with a different supervisor before. And just naming the relationships in the room helps to create safety, so I don't accidentally stumble upon something and wish I'd known it before.
How I'm making sense of that is what we're actually doing is removing as much as we can some of the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that frees up headspace for people and an emotional space, I think, when people, because so much of what we do isn't certain and the work isn't certain, but actually how can we provide some certainty?
Yes, and so within that there's the positioning piece that we've talked about positioning, contextual positioning, relational positioning. There's also then the how can we reinforce the safety here, and that might be some of the things I think people typically think about when it comes to contracting are around confidentiality and consent, any of the legal boundaries and policies, etc., that might be in place. I think added to that, there's something around the philosophy of practice. If we position what are my beliefs as the holder of the space, or the creator of the container, I co-create it with you, but I'm leading on that as the supervisor, whether it's one-to-one or with a group. So again, that's about reducing some of the unknowns, and we can't reduce all of those, but the more clarity we can create, or the more transparency we can create, it helps to create a sense of emotional safety, emotional containment, so that we can do the necessary work. So the philosophy of practice, I think similarly to coaching, you have coaching or mentoring with an individual practitioner, and it will be very different to a different practitioner because of background, training, focus. And people come to these professions with very different backgrounds. You have therapists who become coaches, you have lawyers who become coaches, psychologists who become coaches, clinicians such as yourself who move into the coaching space and supervision space. And those things shape our practice and shape how we show up, our philosophy. And I think there's work to be done for supervisors and coaching practitioners to really understand what are the principles that I really hold dear. So, for example, to bring that to life with some examples, for me, there's something around operating from a position of we are an adult-to-adult partnership of equals. So as a supervisor in our relationship, so I have a particular role, and that is the role that I play in this relationship. But as human beings, we are adult to adult partnership of equals. So we have equal value here. There's something about supervision that denotes an aspect of a power dynamic. And I think the word supervisor doesn't particularly help because of how the word is used elsewhere and in other contexts. But actually it's a role with a purpose. So there's something around, really naming what are the principles from which I operate. Clear is kind, for example, is a principle that I hold really dear in all aspects of my life. And I guess no surprises given that the book I'm writing about, which is contracting and containment, and all of this is about providing clarity to reduce anxiety and to create a space where people can do the necessary work. Ultimately, that is the purpose of contracting, is how do we create boundaries, clarity, definition, so that we can do the work that needs to be done together. Otherwise, what is the point of the supervision?
Yeah. As you say, it just becomes a chat or reinforcing what somebody already thinks or believes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
You're talking a lot about what the supervisor, and that is important because, as you say, that is our role. But I wonder what responsibility coaches coming to supervision need to think about, or if they're exploring kind of different supervisors, like what kind of questions do you think are important from their perspective?
Yeah, really nice question. I think there's something for coaches and supervisors going to supervision, so practitioners going to supervision, around what am I looking for in supervision at the moment? What kind of supervision do I need? at the moment? What does my practice need? What do my clients need from me? And so there may be a developmental aspect to it. It might be I'm looking for something really different to what I've had before, or am I just going to take a recommendation from somebody that I trust? So there's something around what am I looking for in the person of the supervisor? I had a conversation with somebody who asked me about supervision, and I actually said to them, look, I'm very like you. My challenge to you is to go and find somebody very different. Just listening to what their kind of supervision need was. I said, if you really are looking to up your game or to be stretched or to challenge yourself and develop in a different way. And then I was speaking to a white British male at the time, and I said, why don't you find a black woman supervisor or some other different perspective, someone with a different background, someone who's going to challenge your beliefs. And this person was a psychologist as well. I said, I'm a psychologist. I've worked in similar organizations to you. I might be female, but the overlap is greater than the difference. And so if you genuinely want to develop in the way that you want to develop, then move towards something different. What would be uncomfortable for you? Move towards that. Now, I know it's not exactly what you were asking me.
No, but it represents, I think, there.
Yeah, an example of, as a coach looking for supervision or as a supervisor looking for supervision, what's genuinely going to stretch you? How much stretch are you looking for? What is it you're looking for in this relationship? And then choose the supervisor, the human being of the supervisor, and also find out about their philosophy and their principles of practice. And also how they do supervision. Have you always had one-to-one? Do you now want group? Are you looking for a mixture of both? Is the supervision part of helping you to move towards a qualification, for example? Or are you looking to grow your systemic awareness or your somatic awareness? Or, so really asking yourself before you even start to talk to supervisors, what is it my practice needs?
And I don't know about your experience, but my sense is people don't do that enough.
I think often it's recommendations.
Yeah.
Which isn't about, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
We'll suddenly have no work because nobody's going to recommend.
Exactly. So you asked the question, what else do coaches need to do? I think those are probably some of the key points I would make at this point.
And I think that's very much talking about, which is really important, kind of before they approach a supervisor. I wonder if there's anything different in the process of contracting that coaches should be thinking about, or that we as supervisors need to make explicit.
Yeah, very nice. And there's a few things that I think the relationships in the room is really important if it's a group. But I think there's something also about checking on our assumptions. I've done some thinking and reading recently around different perceptions of time. So if we just think of time as a factor and time as a boundary, and time as an aspect of containment. Now, I know within our shared culture here in the British Isles and the overlaps in the professional bodies that there are some, I would dare to say, unchallenged beliefs around time as a boundary. And so if you're working, internationally or globally, just even something as simple as time. In our culture, we look at time and we're clock driven.
Yeah.
And it comes to the minute, we're 5 minutes before the end of our session. And that's a really clear boundary, whereas in some cultures that's very different. So there's something around just checking on our assumptions around all the different parts of the contract. If I just play this out, if as a coach I'm joining an international group, a global group, let's talk about that. How do we treat time as a group? Starting and finishing on time is a Northern Hemisphere, Western
normalization in a way.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So what do we do with that? Do we assume that is going to be the norm in this group? Or what other ways are there to do it? I mean, coming from my cultural heritage and background, why would you do it any differently to that?
Yeah.
And so therefore we need to check in on that assumption.
Yeah.
There's also something around how do I feel about people missing a session if I'm in a group? So if I'm a member of a group, is that something that we're going to talk about in our group contracting? And if it doesn't come up, is it something how do I feel about it? So let me just imagine the beginning of the group. What if next time a couple of people don't show up? One of them told us and one of them didn't. What do I feel and think about that? And how are we going to talk about that as a group? And can we talk about that in the early stages so that we can have an understanding around it? What do we do if somebody says something that I violently disagree with? Or somebody does something that I feel offended by? How do we handle that? And so talking about those things as part of the contracting can be really powerful. And it doesn't have to be in the first session.
Yes.
It's an ongoing conversation.
I think, and maybe we haven't emphasised that enough. And it would be good to hear your view around, I think often contracting can get sidelined into, I do it either in the chemistry session or I do it in the first bit of the first session, and then it's done and dusted apart from what are we doing today?
Yeah.
What's your view?
My view, and where I've kind of come to my current position, and I think that's important because it has evolved. I mean, the model that I started writing about has actually shifted and changed now that I'm halfway through writing the book. So my current position is that we create a platform on which we do the work. I talk a lot about and use metaphors quite a bit, both in my work and webinars and training, and also in the book itself, there's a lot of metaphor. And so the metaphor I like very much when it comes to creating a contract is that of a platform. And if we think about the purpose of a platform is to raise things up into view so that all of the people who need to see can see what's happening. And the platform might be a soapbox or it might be a stage. It's built for purpose, for whatever needs to play out on the platform. And so to your question, is it something that when and how much do we do the contracting? We might need to do maintenance. We might need to add a bit. We might need to build a fence around the edge of it. Halfway through, we realise actually there's things spilling off the top of this platform. There may be maintenance to keep it safe, to keep it fit for purpose. Or there might be a complete rebuild if it's no longer fit for purpose. So just using that idea of a platform for metaphor is really helpful. We definitely need to do some upfront thinking about what kind of platform is needed, some upfront building. But then there's maintenance and potential rebuilds along the way.
I think that's interesting because that also, you probably, like me, might work with groups for quite a long period of time and the groups might evolve, or you've been working with an individual for a long period of time. Is there particular points that you go, okay, once a year we look at this? Or I'm guessing it's more fluid than that, but I won't make assumptions, Anna.
Yes, it's an it depends, I think, which is always a really frustrating answer, but it depends. I would suggest that revisiting the contract periodically for coaches who have a set way of doing coaching, shall we say. What's quite different in supervision is that those relationships tend to be longer. Often we can have a supervisory relationship that lasts for years. Often, not always, but it's a long-term relationship where a coach, a practitioner may not have experience of that ongoing relationship. So that's something to be clear about. As a supervisor with our coachees or with our supervisees, is that their understanding of the length of the relationship, let's just bring that into the open and talk that through around the recontracting and how we might need to do that over time. Is it a rolling relationship or is it for a defined period of time? So there are some similarities and crossovers there, but in my experience, supervision relationships are often longer term than coaching relationships, which seem to be more boundaried, possibly because of who's paying for it and who the sponsors are, and they're part of a program within an organization, etc.
And you were talking earlier about actually asking that question, what do you want and what do you need? And I think that's a useful question in long-term supervision because it can get comfortable, particularly for the coach, potentially,
yes.
Abby, but also for us as supervisors, and actually checking, is this, or do we know each other too well? And what are your priorities moving forward? I think.
Yeah, I agree.
That's a brave question and probably an important question, and maybe one we don't ask enough because we don't want to lose work. Let's be frank.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I think as coaches, that decision is not always ours to make or the coachees to make. As supervisors, we need to ethically really own that. And so although in coaching, we also need to remain aware of the relationship and the work continuing to do what it's intended to do and intended to be, with supervision, that becomes even more important. So the recontracting, a really good relationship, a sound relationship, will ensure that recontract. And what we mean by that is that we come back to, is this what needs to change in our relationship? We've grown together. We've matured together. Perhaps we've been working together for a year or longer. Let's come back to how have we changed? Because as supervisor, I learn from my supervisees and my practice develops in the same way that as a coach. You know, there's a reason why we develop and mature as coaches over the years, because through our practice we're learning, not just through our CPD, but we also learn through practice. And the same is true of us as supervisors, that our practice improves over time. And so if I'm working with you as a supervisee for a long period of time, our relationship will grow and develop. And if it stagnates, that either requires us to have a really good contracting conversation. Or if our relationship cannot withstand that, then it's time for us both to move on. And you're right, it requires courage and vulnerability, which is what we are looking to be doing with our clients anyway. So
yeah, we want to model that, don't we? It feels important. I wonder about the other layer, and you were talking about systemic earlier, but you started this conversation saying so much of what comes into supervision, whether it's case studies or themes, often comes back to contracting. How does that work when you're supporting coaches in supervision to think about their contracting in their own coaching relationships?
So there's something about role modeling good practice, and I would go further to say is doing it explicitly. So as part of the formative aspect of supervision.
We know what we mean by formative, but if you could just explain that term, Anna.
Yeah, great. So there's one of the models of supervision has 3 functions of supervision, or I'm going to forget them now: formative, normative,
formative and restorative. They just come off.
Thank you. Yeah.
You say restorative much nicer than I do, so
do
you
I?
say it in your
Restorative.
accent.
So the formative function is around skill development. And so I see role modeling, but explicitly naming it. So I was going to do a timeout signal, but of course our listeners can't see that. But
they all know what it is, though, I would imagine.
A process comment, say, okay, so we're going to move into talking about this aspect of contracting. So I just want to make that really clear. This is how I do it. We're going to experience that together. And I'll take a little moment to see, well, how might the way we've just done that as a group, how might you take that into your own practice? Where would it work? Where doesn't it work? What did you like? Didn't you like about that? So almost doing a bit of train the trainer, shall we say, or a bit of a process review, so that part of the supervision is also a formative or a skill development process.
It's almost like double loop learning, isn't it? Of experiential, but then unpicking, okay, well, how might I transfer that? What out of this do I want to bring into my practice? And then when people are more explicitly bringing contracting issues, challenges to supervision, is there then a model that you use, particularly, I guess, in that formative, or no, actually, maybe does it change from less experienced coaches to more experienced, or how do you work with that?
I use metaphor quite a lot, and in a similar way where we use our client's own language. I like to work with the supervisee's own language here as well. Every now and again, I do a webinar on contracting and containment and invite people to bring their own metaphor and then work with that, because there's some real power in what does the metaphor tell you. So using perhaps a clean language approach, which, again, for our listeners' sake, if you haven't come across it, it's minimal interpretation from the practitioner to allow the individual, the client, to find their own wisdom within their own metaphor and their own use of language. So if I bring that to life, I'll have a model. I have a model or a scaffold in my own mind, like we do, I guess, in our coaching practice. We may have a particular approach or various approaches that we use. And similarly, for me with contracting, I have a model or a scaffold to support the contracting conversation. But I won't necessarily overlay that onto everything that we do. I'll more likely ask questions to help draw out the wisdom of the group or the individual to help them identify their own approach.
And is the model you're talking about the 6P model, Anna, or is that something else?
Well, it used to be.
It used to be. It's evolved.
It has.
So last year.
You are indeed so last year. So it started out with 6Ps and it's actually the 8P model of program contracting now.
And can I put you on the spot and ask you to...
You can. I mean, whether I join you on the spot is another question. Yes, absolutely. So I've touched on quite a few of those Ps already. So I think we've mentioned philosophy, we've mentioned purpose, we've mentioned psychological safety. And I know it sounds like an S, but that does actually begin with a P.
With a P.
So there are 8 of these structural parts of the conversation, and it's not intended to be a tick list. Like any good scaffold, it's there as there's a term that we actually use the term scaffolding in educational psychology. We scaffold people's learning, or metaphors do that as well for us. It enables us to hold on to quite a few different ideas or concepts in a way that to facilitate the conversation. So the model isn't intended to be a script or a tick box. If I'm holding that in my mind, I can concentrate on or be present. And every now and again, I'll just check in on the scaffolding. Is there any bit that feels a bit wobbly? I am wobbling now for those who can't see me. any parts of the platform. It's the platform needs to be built on these 8 pillars. And if there's a wobble in the platform, we're checking out, where's the wobble? Is it psychological safety? Is it that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, what are the others?
How much of my book do I going to give away here, Helen?
I'm sorry. There you go. Bullet points. If they want the detail.
We might have to wait until 2026 for the whole book. So we've talked about purpose and philosophy and psychology, which isn't just about psychological safety, but there's a range of other things in there. And there's also practicalities, in terms of cadence and cancellation. And so the kind of nuts and bolts, crunchy stuff, which I think is a space people are more comfortable
yes,
contracting around. There's the people. So that was the final P that I added in, and it just felt like there was something missing. And that is within the positioning part of the model. There's the systemic positioning, and that also includes relational positioning. So you might be familiar with relational constellations. It's in that kind of territory, or it might just be stakeholder awareness, stakeholder mapping. I've lost track of which P's I've mentioned, but I think the one I haven't mentioned is the personal, and that is around personal needs. And that can be anything from previous experience of, in this case, supervision, what I'm looking for now, or it might be a protected characteristic. So it might be I want to meet in person and it needs to be in this kind of an accessible space or a quiet space. So this is about that personal needs piece. And I'm sure I've missed a P in there somewhere.
I think you have. It's okay. I won't put you on the spot anymore. Talking about the personal has led me to asking you about the cultural aspects.
Yeah, nice.
You've already talked about the concept of time, which is something I hadn't really thought about.
Yeah, so there's that linear versus non-linear time. I've mentioned that in terms of being ruled by the clock, which is very much, slave to the clock, a slave to time is very Northern Hemisphere, Western versus a community and relationships base. So in some of the Southern Hemisphere cultures, you're not ruled by the clock so much as to how much time is needed to get the purpose is far more important. What is the purpose? Well, then we'll take whatever time is needed to achieve that purpose. So it's a very different perception of time and experience of time. There's also an individual versus a shared focus, which can be different in different parts of the world, in different geographies, different cultures. In terms of if I'm coming to supervision, depending on where I come from, I might be thinking about me as a practitioner. Whereas if I have a more community shared focus, I may be more thinking about the system and what the system demands. And again, the individual focus is very Western culture, whereas a community shared responsibility focus would be something that you would experience in a culture that's different to the one in which we are both located right now. And I think where it becomes really interesting is where you're working across cultural boundaries. And I guess the challenge I would hold for myself and for all of us as supervisors is how do we make sure that we don't overlay our cultural, let's call them biases, norms and biases, onto the work that we do elsewhere. And in fact, in all of the work that we do. How do we continue to hold the growth mindset and openness, a curiosity to different ways of being, different ways of doing? Yeah, and to do that in a genuine way.
I don't know about you, but I feel like that's an even bigger challenge for myself with something like contracting, which is probably my most structured part of any conversation. And so I think I really need to challenge myself around that. So thank you for putting that challenge out to all of us.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're doing this series on supervision, I'm sure you have all your speakers lined up already, but, maybe if you haven't already considered it, inviting supervisors from very different cultural backgrounds to find out what does it look like there, I will definitely listen to that episode. I'm so curious and interested to find out about, what is it? Because I think I know Charmaine Roach has done some amazing work on decolonizing the coaching and supervision professions and just really raising the bar on challenging us to think about this from a global perspective.
Unfortunately, I haven't got Charmaine coming, but we are having a round table around that kind of stuff with a couple of different people from different cultures. So
fabulous.
Listen out for that.
I shall.
Again, I'm going to ask you an impossible question probably, but I have all faith in you, Anna, around kind of looking towards the future.
Okay.
What do you think the future is and the kind of how do we need to evolve
in
terms of particularly contracting in relation to supervision? And
Well, I think global awareness is really important. And the more, particularly since the pandemic, that we are working across geographical boundaries, and there are more and more supervision groups that are global groups with difference. So I think that is increasingly important. Arguably, it's always been important, but I think the need to be globally aware and culturally aware is really important. There's also the growth of technology and artificial intelligence. There's a responsibility that we have in this as supervisors. So there's a need for us to be explicitly developing our own awareness of what does that mean for practice, for coaching practice, for supervision practice, and for any other areas of practice that we have. What are the risks and benefits within that? What are our own principles of practice? So coming back to the philosophy, so that we don't just blindly follow or blindly ignore.
Oh, yeah.
So how can we maintain an awareness? So there's work there, that requires effort and work and moving towards uncomfortable areas, confronting our fears often for a lot of people. There's a number of different areas of practice that are evolving as well. So eco-coaching, as an example, creative methods. There's been some great books in that space in recent times. Coaching in and with nature. So all of these kinds of areas of practice seem to be evolving and growing. And so as a supervisor, whether those are parts of your practice or not, they're very likely going to be coming into the practice of some of the people that you supervise. So just keeping an eye on what areas of practice are evolving, I think, is something for us to consider as well. Yeah, I think the systemic awareness and the impact of things like colonialism, privilege, Northern Hemisphere centric, Eurocentric, all of that is saturated into, I would argue, coaching and supervision as practices. And even just recognizing that and, even hearing me say that, what does that do in you? As you're listening to this, what does that trigger in you? And be curious about that. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm asking it of us as a profession to challenge our thinking and to check where are we making assumptions and what are we uncomfortable about? I heard a fantastic TED talk years ago, and I can't remember for the life of me who it was and what it was about. But
somebody listened to the podcast. If you know the answer, tell Anna.
It's one of those, did you see the movie with the guy in it? That one. But the thing that stuck with me from it was this challenge to move towards your discomfort. And it really has stayed with me. And it was in the territory of looking at difference and diversity, etc. But moving towards our discomfort. And I think for us as supervisors, if we cannot be aware, or if we aren't aware of what causes me some discomfort, where it goes eek, or some kind of internal reaction, whether physical, visceral, emotional, defensiveness, that's what we need to be curious about, because that will come into our practice and it will catch us out if we aren't holding curiosity about it.
And we're not practicing what we preach or being who we say we are being. So,
indeed.
So as we wrap up, Anna, again, a tough question, but I'm going to ask you to summarise what you would like our listeners to take away from our discussion, do you think?
Well, I hope that if you started out thinking, oh goodness, contracting, what a dry subject, how boring. I hope that it's inspired at least a few people to realise that it's actually, not only is it in a scary way, shall we say, an essential aspect of our work, but for me, I hope I've ignited some passion, some excitement about the potential to really hone and develop this skill. After all, if all of our professional bodies are telling us that it's necessary, and if every coaching book that we read has at least a paragraph, if not a chapter on this.
I'm hoping more than a paragraph.
I know. As far as I'm aware, and I'm really hoping that I'm not wrong about this, there isn't a book as yet dedicated to the subject. And I hope that it's ignited interest and curiosity in some of your listeners to dig a bit deeper. I genuinely believe that it is a core practice, it's core to our practice. Everything else plays out upon
I'm gonna say,
and within the contract, the container that we create. And so therefore, we need to enthusiastically,
joyfully, I would say.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you, and I think the magic happens because of great contracting.
Yeah, agreed.
It's been wonderful to talk to you about it. Thank you so much for sharing your passion.
My pleasure.
Anna, I'm sure lots of people will have had their interest sparked. How can they get in touch with you? What different things are on offer that you would like to tell our listeners about?
Well, I'm really happy for anyone to connect with me on LinkedIn. It's just Anna Springett, all lowercase. Springett, for those of you who are curious, is spelled spring as in the season with E-double-T on the end. So Anna Springett on LinkedIn.
And we will put the links in the podcast notes as well.
Marvellous. Lovely. And my email address is available on LinkedIn as well if anybody wants to reach out. It's Anna@annaspringett.com. You can find out a bit more about me and my services on annaspringett.com, as you would probably have guessed. But probably what I'd love to tell your listeners about is my subsidiary business, which is Oki Retreats, where we do professional retreats for organizations, teams, leaders and coaches. And so coaches and supervisors might be interested to find out about Mastery with Soul, which is every 18 months or so. My colleague Claire Norman and I host a retreat in the New Forest. So I'd love to hear from anyone who would like to find out more about that.
I highly recommend it. I've been privileged enough to attend, and it
yes,
was a very restorative and inspiring place to be. So,
thank you.
What a joy to talk to you, Anna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.